we would like, therefore, to welcome them. As we do, can I remind you that you will be asked, when you ask your questions, to keep them brief. We will, of course, do our best to ensure that all questions are answered, but we cannot guarantee it. Please join me in welcoming tonight's panel. Tonight's panel will be chaired by Fernando. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming tonight. We have 4 parliamentary candidates for tonight's Hustings. Daniel Zeichner representing the Labour Party, Rupert from the Green Party, Chamali Fernando from the Conservatives, and Julian Huppert from the Liberal Democrat Party.
Regarding the structure of this debate, we'll start with 3 minutes introductions from each of the candidates, then questions from both Matteo and me, which will concentrate on the European, national and local level, and then questions from the floor. The questions from the floor will be about 45 minutes. So I would now like to ask candidates starting from the left to introduce themselves, please.
Well, hello and thank you. I'm Daniel Zeichner, I'm the Labour candidate. I'm looking slightly breathless. It's because an hour ago I was standing on the terraces at Cambridge United for their last game of the season. And I have 2 passions in life really in Cambridge, I guess. One is the football and the other one is Kettle's Yard, the concerts they have on Thursday night. And this beautiful room is where the Kettle's Yard concerts will be moving when that place is shut for renovation. So this is my twin passions. You'll be glad to know Cambridge United finished the season on a high. Now, I'm Daniel Zeichner. You'll guess that from my name that I've got European connections. My father was born and brought up in Vienna. I was born and brought up in Beckenham, which is rather different in South London. And I guess I'm going to make no apologies for being very, very pro-European tonight, because for me, it's my family history in a way. It kind of encapsulates the story of the last century. People moving from country to country. My grandfather was a farm worker in Shepworth, which is a village just outside Cambridge. Some of you have gone through it on the railway line, probably quite frequently. He was a working class agricultural worker. He was self-taught, and it's part of the story of the last century, I guess, the social mobility. He used to sit outside King's College, reading his paperback books. No chance that a working class man would get into an institution like this. So when I got into Cambridge, my mum was so pleased and so proud. She chose it, I guess, rather than me in many ways. But a huge change for my family in the last century. And for my father, his family, a story so familiar to so many people, I suspect, of being displaced by war and actually finding a home in Britain. And that's why the European Union seems to me to be just so important. Leave aside all the arguments about the bureaucracy and the rules. Peace. Peace is really worth having. And anybody who's been through any experience different to that, I think would always put that absolutely at the top. So there'll be some who will say, well, it wasn't the European Union that kept the peace, but actually, I was a historian here, and I think we look back, and that's exactly why it was formed. And I think we're in a much better place now than we were in the last century. But of course, at the moment, huge stresses and strains. But I say I'm unashamedly pro-European. In my professional career, I've worked in the public sector, private sector. I now work for a national trade union. I'm a negotiator, and I think that's what the European Union's about. And we'll go on to that in a minute. But I'm actually quite proud of the way Europe functions. I think the trade-offs between nations, between interests, how much better to do it through arguing in a democratic forum than fighting one another. So that's me. I look forward to your questions. And this is the 30th of 30 Hustings events. So it's the finish line, which is why I guess we're all looking possibly a touch happy and relieved. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Rupert Reid. I'm the Green Party candidate in this election. Delighted to be here this evening. As Daniel says, this is the last one. This is your last chance to interrogate us all like this. It's been a long campaign, and on Thursday it will be over. In this seat in Cambridge, some of you may be thinking, yes, still not sure who to vote for. I hope some of you are still thinking, still not sure who to vote for. But there's something to play for. And if you are thinking that, you might be thinking, well, yes, the Labour candidate's got quite a lot to offer. Then again, the incumbent MP has not done a bad job. But, you know, I don't want to slag my fellow candidates off. I've been impressed with them by and large in the course of this campaign. And I don't envy you the choice that you've got to make. So say you're tossing up between Labour and Lib Dem. There's another way. There is another way you can vote here in Cambridge. This was our third strongest seat at the last general election. I was your candidate for MEP in European elections here last year. We got 20% in Cambridge. Since then we've had the green surge, we've moved forward in the polls, we've grown enormously as a party, we're strong in this seat and we're on the up. More importantly still, the things that we stand for, I bet, are the things that many of you stand for. Did you know that when people do blind tests on sites like Vote Match, Vote for Policies, the Green Party nearly always comes up top? People say, oh wow, it turns out I'm a Green Party voter. Why? Well, because we have the right policies, dare I say it, on so many things. On everything from dangerous climate change to foreign aid, on everything from more locally making serious provision for public transport and person-powered transport to protecting the green belt and ensuring that the character of Cambridge is not destroyed by the expansion that is impending. If you believe in what we believe in, I would urge you this Thursday to vote for what you believe in. You can try tossing up between the others, or you can vote for something that's actually going to be different. The only party that's going to make a difference to business as usual. I'm finding on the doorsteps absolutely no enthusiasm for any of the old parties. The one party that is on the up is the Green Party. If I convince you in what we're about to hear in the next hour and a quarter or so, please do the right thing. Vote Green on Thursday. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and well done for organising this hustings. I'm relieved, actually, that it's the last hustings. I've been out campaigning on the doorstep today, so I feel it's nice to just relax a little bit and talk to more people than just one person every doorstep you go to. My name's Chamali Fernando, and I'm 36 years old. I've been at the bar for Middle Temple as a barrister for 12 years, representing people from all walks of life. Sometimes those who are the most vulnerable in our society, facing jail, loss of their job, loss of their home, collapse of their business. What moves me to go into politics is the opportunity to actually help shape legislation and therefore help more people. I'm also a policy advisor to set up an international court for the environment, so I believe in international cooperation on big issues such as climate change. The other hat that I wear is an international qualification. I'm a licensed attorney for the State Bar of New York, and I believe that we have lessons to learn from some of our international partners. If you want a strong, pragmatic green voice in Parliament, you have the chance at this election with my candidacy. Cambridge is a city of pioneers in science, technology, innovation and research. We have, through the EU, secured more funding for science, and that has been driven into places like Cambridge. This is the global seat of learning, yet for too long Cambridge has been inward-looking. This is your chance to elect an MP who has a greater vision for Cambridge, an MP with an international outlook. Now, of course, 12 years as a barrister, representing people in ordinary, everyday situations, I'm not going to forget my bread and butter, which comes so naturally to me. But this is our chance to make Cambridge the global benchmark for a greener, fairer, more sustainable society. And there's three ways that I'm looking to achieve that objective. First of all, I need your vote to get into Parliament. Secondly, improving quality of life for everyone, championing welfare for those in need, supporting young families and children, creating job opportunities, and building that greener, fairer, sustainable society. It's possible. The will of the people here in Cambridge makes this such an attractive seat in terms of our political opportunities. So come with me, ladies and gentlemen, on this journey. The 7th of May, it's not long, but the opportunity is ours. Please take it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm Julian Huppert, and it's been a huge pleasure to serve as the Member of Parliament here for the last 5 years. And as others have said, this is the last of our 30 or so hustings. We've been on tour together for a long time. We could probably do each other's songs now. And we've talked about lots of things. I've talked about getting more money in for schools, for the NHS, particularly mental health. I've talked about housing and transport. And I've talked about values, and it's that which I really want to talk about now. And I've always identified 4 key values for me. And they come very much from my upbringing. Both my parents originally came from Europe. My mother was born in a refugee camp in Uzbekistan, which I guess makes you always have an internationalist outlook. So I'm a liberal. I want to empower people. I'm an environmentalist, so I've championed a strong response to climate change. I'm also committed to social justice, helping to lift people up out of poverty and collect more from the wealthier. But that idea of being an internationalist is really what I want to talk about today, because it is so important and too rare. And it's what got me into politics. I originally got involved in the United Nations through something called Model United Nations. Some of you may have come across it. A way of thinking about what's happening in the world, human rights issues around the world. I also got very interested then in international aid and what we do to help other countries. We as a country set a target in 1970 saying we made a promise that we would spend 0.7% of our gross national income on international aid. We promised it and then we never bothered to do it. 43 years later we finally got round to it in this government. And I was very proud to co-sponsor the legislation that now makes it the law that we must spend 0.7% on other countries. It's too important not to do. And I'm a passionate pro-European. I'm really passionate about Europe. I even live in Europe, right here. And it matters. And it matters. Because there are huge international issues which we simply can't challenge on our own. There's lots we can do, but working with others is much more powerful. If you want to talk about climate change, you can do much more working with others. If you want to talk about cross-border crime, international terrorism, working with Europe, European arrest warrant and other things matters. We could bring back the London bomber Hussein Osman in just 2 months rather than waiting for years. And it matters for our economy. The vast majority of businesses want us to stay. Confederation of British Industry say it's about £70 billion a year it brings to our economy, £3,000 per household. It matters for science and research. It helps this university to function. There's human movement, allowing people to go from here to there and there to here, students to come and study, Erasmus. All of that is because of the European Union. And of course, there's peace. Is it perfect? No. It's far from perfect. But I'm pro-Westminster, and Westminster's certainly not perfect either. There's much we could improve. We could stop travelling between 2 different sites. We could stop the policy laundering, where countries force policies through the European Union because they're too scared to do them themselves. But the challenge we face now is the rise of UKIP, which has opened up the space for xenophobia, for people to blame foreigners, blame Europeans for everything that's going wrong. And we must stand firm. I'm proud that Nick Clegg did so last year, the only party leader to actually take on Nigel Farage for those European election debates. We didn't win the elections, but we changed the mindset and people are now more pro-European than they were. So I'm proudly internationalist, proudly pro-European, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you very much for your opening remarks. My first question goes to Chamali. You know that we are the Cambridge University European Society, so there is a very big European audience here. And you're the only one that hasn't really addressed the EU in your opening remarks. So my question would be, what is your position on the EU? Are you favourable to a British exit referendum? And in general, if yes, how would you imagine UK leaving the EU? How would you imagine the EU without the UK?
I don't imagine EU without the UK, and I thought I would reserve these comments for the question because I'm sure that they're bound to come up, particularly to a Conservative candidate. My position is yes to a referendum and yes to staying in Europe. Britain will be stronger in a renegotiated Europe. We've lost some of our powers to Brussels, particularly under the last government, and we need to get back some of those powers, and we need to stand tall. And I genuinely believe my generation, ergo most of the people in this room, have not had the opportunity to vote on Europe. Since my candidacy in July 2014, I have gone around Cambridge, knocking on doors, listening and learning to the issues that matter to people on the doorstep for our city and for our country. In certain parts of Cambridge, you don't talk about immigration, or you don't talk about the EU. In other parts of Cambridge, Cherry Hinton, King's Hedges, Arbury, the EU is a really big issue, and the issues are polarised on Europe. So let's have that debate. Democracy is a form of having a referendum and having your vote on that one issue. And let's ventilate the issues that matter to people. Give the people the chance. We trust you to take the right decision on Europe. And the right decision would be to stay in Europe. But we also recognise that Europe has become too bureaucratic and too undemocratic. And therefore, that's why we're looking for reform.
So what exactly do you propose to change?
Well, for example, take the EU Audit Commission. I was very fortunate when I was 21 to visit European legal institutions. The Audit Commission, no one audits the Audit Commission. So in terms of the budget, no one actually knows. There's a big black hole there. There's laws such as whether we should impose prisoners' rights to vote. We have a great established legal system in this country, one that I'm very proud of. But in court sometimes, you end up dealing with European Court of Human Rights issues, which are applied in a way that actually makes our own legislation, which is very well established, look foolish. It doesn't happen all the time. Sometimes it's good, it's in our favour, and it's incremental to what we have already in this country. But other times we find ourselves hitting a wall with Europe. There have been countless cases involving Article 8 rights to private and family life, involving foreign defendants who might have a family in this country, a family in Europe. Sorry.
Quite interesting, Rupert, for your answer on that.
Yeah, well, I just want to start where Chamali was just there, because the first point to make is the European Court of Human Rights has nothing to do with the EU, so a bit of a technical faux pas there. Second point is I would say, is that actually I'm really proud that the European Court of Human Rights is something that we subscribe to, and that it's made some really good decisions, including specifically on the question of prisoner voting rights. I think it's actually disgraceful and absurd that this country has tried to stop prisoners from being able to vote. How are we supposed to reintegrate prisoners back into society if they're not allowed to vote? I mean, you know, what is prison for? Is it just to lock them up and throw away the key? Well, I know some people on the right wing in this country want to think of it like that, but I think most of us who are reasonably humane think that what prison ought to be about is about reconciling the prisoner and the rest of the community. How are you going to do that if you ban prisoners from voting? So I don't think that's a very good example of a power that we want back. Just to step back a moment to look at the general debate, what we tend to get in this debate is the Conservatives and UKIP slagging the EU off, and Labour and the Lib Dems saying, no, the EU's good, we like the EU. And what gets lost in this is the dimension that we in the Greens want to bring to the table, which is that we in the Greens are absolutely determined internationalists, totally, and we are, if you will, the supreme internationalists. We think of the whole earth as being the essential topic of politics. But we also think that we need to look critically at the EU and look at what's wrong with it, because there is quite a bit that's wrong with it. It is far, far too insufficiently democratic. The EU Parliament doesn't have enough powers. Everyone goes on about the Commission, but actually the worst feature of the EU is the very, very secretive Council. I'm sorry? Yeah, okay, I haven't had very long, but I'll just, one more sentence.
There's so much to say.
Yeah, yes, the EU Council, very, very undemocratic. We would like to make the EU more democratic, and we would like to have more transparency of lobbying. Maybe I can elaborate on these things in the next few minutes.
Okay, so I have a question to Julian. You mentioned that you're passionately pro-European. In that case, how would you tackle rising Euroscepticism within the UK, but in Europe generally?
I think this is a really interesting question, because what's happened in this country is we've failed to talk about the good things Europe does. We've kept it very silent. When Europe funds a project here, we forget to tell anybody. And so people don't see the things that are coming in. Most people have no idea how much European money comes into this university, for example. So let's start telling people about it, and let's try and dispel the myths that have been peddled by the Tories, peddled by the right-wing press. We hear stories again and again about the Court of Auditors refuse to sign off the accounts. It's simply not true. They sign them off every year. Occasionally countries make errors, like the UK. We find people who deliberately confuse the European Convention on Human Rights with the European Union. They're different things. Just very quickly on prisoner voting. I don't think we should have prisoners allowed to vote because the ECHR says so. I think we should because it's the right thing to do anyway, and we shouldn't have to have judges tell us that being humane to prisoners is the right thing to do. I was one of a very small band of 22 MPs who stayed back to vote against a proposal from Labour and the Conservatives to say that we should not allow prisoners to vote. We knew we would lose, but I think it's the right thing to do to rehabilitate, and prison governors do as well. And this referendum, if it happens, would be incredibly damaging to our country. It would mean that for a year, 2 years, we'd be paralysed, navel-gazed, and there are so many more important things to do. Businesses thinking of investing here would simply go elsewhere because they wouldn't want that uncertainty. So just because David Cameron can't unite the Eurosceptic wing of his party with the pro-Europe wing of his party doesn't mean we should cause such huge problems for the country.
Daniel, I think we have talked quite a lot on the EU in your opening remarks, so I would have liked to ask you a question moving on to another topic. Recently there's been shipwrecks that have caused the death of 900 people in a week in the Mediterranean Sea. I would like to know what you propose to react to that situation. What's your policy? Because we talk a lot about how it's dramatic, but we don't really hear any solutions that would work in the long term to avoid this kind of catastrophes.
Okay. I'd like to talk about the European Union too, but I'll address your question. And partly, it actually does go back to the European Union about how you build alliances within the European Union to do things. We're all talking about how we'd like to change things in the European Union. But the thing that's spectacular about this government is its failure to build any sensible alliances. So when you come to an issue like this, if you want to do something, you've got to have others to work with. Now, Ed Miliband made quite a major speech probably 2 weeks ago on the Libyan conflict. And what he said was, and I think absolutely right, that Cameron went into it without thinking through what happens afterwards. And this has been a major flaw in British foreign policy in recent times. So the answer to your question is, if you're going to intervene in places, for goodness sake, A, make sure you know what you're trying to achieve, and B, have proper follow-through afterwards. So that's going to involve working with our allies. And certainly within the European Union, my feeling is that we're now increasingly isolated. The problem with Cameron's approach is it's become inward-looking and defensive.
So if you had to propose 3 points, for example, to resolve the shipwreck crisis? Look,
that crisis is not going to be resolved in 3 points. It goes fundamentally. I mean, Libya is now a fragile, destroyed, failed state. There's going to be a whole range of things you're going to have to do in that region. So I'm not going to give you 3 simple, easy points to solving it. But what we know is you've got to have engagement. You've got to work with those countries. And that's going to involve some serious resources at some point as well. Now, I agree with Julian on the foreign aid issue. Labour actually was committed to that in the last Parliament. It's been achieved in this Parliament, and that's a really good thing. But the danger with the debate at the moment in this country is it becomes increasingly dominated by UKIP, unfortunately, is we're beginning to withdraw from intervening in the rest of the world, moving away from helping. If the problems aren't solved at source, then you get these awful tragedies. And we all say, it's awful. What do you do? The answer is look back to the mistakes we've made in the past and make sure we don't repeat them in the future.
Rupert, how would you generally see the role of the EU in regard to security policy, so also in relation to national policies, obviously?
Yeah. So this is a complex area. Obviously, it's been altered since the Lisbon Treaty was brought in. We as Greens have some reservations about the Lisbon Treaty in this regard. We are concerned that there might be a kind of a movement towards some kind of European army which has insufficiently careful public oversight. I'm not saying that's going to happen, I'm just saying that's something that we're watching for. The reason we're concerned about that is that we as Greens fundamentally believe that defence policy ought to be about defence and not about offence. And we're concerned that too many countries in Europe, including most notably the UK, have basically had ministries of war rather than ministries of defence for the whole of our existence since we had an empire. They were rebranded as ministries of defence, but they're still essentially ministries of war, and we can see that again and again in recent times, most strikingly in Iraq, but of course there are other cases as well. So my point is, what we as Greens want to do is to ensure that whatever posture is taken up by the UK government or by Europe is a defensive one and not an offensive one. And we would want to be reassured very carefully about that before committing to further development of EU security policy.
Thank you, Julian. Would you agree with that? Would you see that the defensive position is actually good, or would you prefer to have a bit of a more aggressive position and preemptive strike in some parts of the dangerous zones?
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of preemptive military action. I was one of the people who marched against Labour's war in Iraq. We all know the harms that caused, which is why it's good to hear advice from Labour leaders about not attacking places without knowing what's going to happen afterwards. But we've also had a couple of incidences this time. There was a question about military intervention in Syria. There was a question about military intervention in Iraq. And both times I voted against those. On Syria I voted against both the government's proposals for military intervention and also those from Ed Miliband. Fortunately, for various reasons we ended up winning on that. We didn't win on Iraq. I don't think, in general, bombing people is a good way to bring peace. I think it's far more, and I think this is where Europe can work much more effectively, is about stabilising nations. Because the reason you get to the problems is when you have failed states. And that can be caused by climate change, it can be caused by warlords, it can be caused by all sorts of things, and they interact. So that's why, for me, diplomacy, international aid, are likely to be far, far more effective at preventing these problems, rather than just waiting for the problems to get really, really bad, and then sending in a few bombers.
Sorry, I have another question. Would that also be the way in which you would solve the issues regarding terrorism, and where do you see the role of the EU in that?
So, I mean, the issues around terrorism are really interesting. I met the families of the 3 girls who went out to join Islamic State. So it's quite interesting to understand that. And again, a lot of things I just said apply exactly the same way. The way to combat terrorism is fundamentally to make sure there are stable, strong nations around, because terrorism breeds where that doesn't happen. So stabilise the areas. And then deal with the reasons why people are subscribing to these extremist ideals. Why is it that many Muslims, particularly men in this country, feel alienated from society? It's partly because of stop and search, it's partly because of Schedule 7 detention, so people feel that the authorities are hostile to them. Change that, change our British foreign policy so it's not seen as being a sort of an anti-Islamic force, which is not what it should be at all. I think we'll then start to see real controls. We can then do a lot online, so a lot of recruiting online, to look at what's called counter-speech. So when somebody finds a YouTube video explaining why you should be extreme, make sure the next thing that comes along and all the links are from imams or whoever it might be saying, and this is why you shouldn't. That's a really effective way, rather than trying to silence things.
Chamali, do you agree to that? Has the Conservative policy against domestic terrorism to move on to the domestic level, has it worked? Are we going to go towards the road of limiting individual rights? Are we going to rather keep them really safe? What to do to avoid Charlie Hebdo in England?
Well, we've already started, the imams have started a website where they can start putting out positive propaganda and starting to engage with groups that feel disenfranchised. And about a month ago, there was a movement, it was reported in the Times, with imams starting this website. In terms of domestic terrorism, yes, we have to look at why 3 teenage girls who were considered A-star students were enticed to go abroad. But unless you've actually represented or dealt with a terror suspect or interrogated a terror suspect, how do you know what is going on in their mindset? And we need to make sure that we are reaching out to different communities. Our first port of call would be to ensure that people who live in this country feel that this is their home, feel that they can naturally exercise their democratic rights at elections. And how did we get to the stage that of the Lee Rigby disaster in Woolwich, where the mother of one of the boys actually had approached a probation officer in the past and said, there are issues with my son, please help me, but she didn't get the help that she needed. So that's examples where society has failed. What I didn't come on to talk about a bit earlier was also the idea of the British Bill of Rights, which is another idea where I believe us and the panel differ entirely, because of the fact that we feel the the Human Rights Act that as applied in this country has also been used to abuse systems, to abuse the legislation that we had in this country. So we would be looking to bring in some of the fair trial procedures that we already have, but actually under a new British Bill of Rights that's enshrined in our constitution here. So in terms of domestic terrorism, I believe that was the main issue.
And please come to a conclusion.
Yeah.
Thank you.
In terms of domestic terrorism, what is it that makes youngsters or people who are not connected to society think that the grass is greener on the other side? And that's what we have to address. And we don't address that by just talking to ourselves.
Daniel, what would you say that are your main aims in regard to change at the national level?
Wow, that's a big question. 120 seconds. Right.
90 seconds.
90 seconds. Okay, let me give you a quick synopsis. One, make sure the economy works better. The Conservatives actually haven't done what they said they were going to do, which is eliminate the deficit. They failed. So a better economic plan. Part of the reason they failed is because so many people are on low pay, exploited 0 hours contracts, so we'll tackle those. And we'll use the money that we get from running the economy better transform things for people in Cambridge around things like the National Health Service, which at the moment is absolutely on the brink and needs massive injection of extra resources. In a city like Cambridge, we'll tackle the crisis of housing, where many people are paying far too much for their rented accommodation. We'll introduce 3-year tenancies for people to stop them being forced out every 6 months because the rents go up. We'll tackle the transport issues because rail fares are too expensive. We'll tackle broken markets, like the energy market, where consumers are being ripped off. And for students, good news, we'll actually cut your tuition fees and we'll fix the funding gap, which is absolutely at the heart of the current student funding system. It is a big black hole which neither of the other parties are addressing. That's probably 89 seconds, but I'll come back if you want more.
I would like to ask a question to Rupert. Everybody seems to be an environmentalist here from the opening speeches. How is your policy the real environmentalist policy? How is the Green Party here and not everyone is?
Yeah, well, obviously, we've been part of what's influenced the debate so that everybody now puts on green clothes. But, you know, there's a difference between putting on green clothes and having a green heart or a green head. And I would say that only we have either of those last two, if that isn't too extreme a metaphor. So, for example, I noticed Chamali talking about having a strong, pragmatic green voice in Parliament. Well, if you're really so green, Chamali, why on earth are you a member of the Conservative Party? The party which has said that they're going to put a stop to onshore wind, the party which has devastated feed-in tariffs for solar, the party which is trying to impose fracking on this country. I mean, I could literally go on and on and on about how abysmally anti-environmental this Conservative-led government has been, and especially the Conservative component of it. But I won't do that. I'll just say that I think that members of the audience know, and really everybody knows, that if you really want to have green action, your best bet is to go with the Green Party. We are the ones who have the absolutely serious policies on this. We're the ones who are saying, as a party, no to fracking. We are the ones who are saying no to nuclear, because despite all the green spin, nuclear is still an unbelievably dirty, toxic fuel. We've got no idea what to do with the waste. We are the ones who are saying, let's insulate every house in Britain, let's stop heating the sky. We're the ones who are saying, let's turn every school and hospital into a power station with renewable energy. It's those kinds of bread and butter policies, and I could give you many more examples, that mean that if you really do want to go green, the Green Party is probably your best bet.
In that context, it has also been said that the problem of actually enforcing environmental regulation has been that we are trying to debate with ourselves on behalf of future generations. So what could be a way of tackling that problem?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it runs to the heart of a fundamental issue with our democratic system, which is our tendency towards short-termism. Very, very difficult one to solve. I'll give a couple of examples of how we would like to try to solve it. One is we need to have a cultural shift, and of course a political shift, right? We need to actually think in our educational institutions, in our political institutions, in a far more long-term way. And if you want to do that again, one very easy, symbolic, as well as practical way that you can do it is by voting for the party which is actually serious about thinking long-term. And secondly, I'd make an institutional point, which is that I think we need to think about institutional changes which could embed long-termism. So one possibility would be entrenching some such principle in the Constitution. For example, you could entrench the precautionary principle in the Constitution. Another possibility would be some kind of parliamentary institution which was devoted to the interests of future generations. I myself have suggested that you could have a kind of third House of Parliament which was devoted to thinking about the future, given that our political system seems to have failed in that way, and that House of Parliament could be selected at random from members of the public, as a jury is. So there are various things we could do. I could be happy to talk more about any of these ideas, but one way or another, we definitely do have to find ways of making sure that we become more long-termist, otherwise our grandchildren will never forgive us.
Thank you very much. And Chanel, you wanted to react on that?
Yeah. The key point Matteo himself made is all the parties on this panel are pro the environment. However, if you continue to push the environment to the left of the political agenda, your voice will not be heard. So it is so important that all parties, and that's in all of our manifestos, there are environmental policies. What have we done recently? Let's take Cambridge as an example. Under this government, we introduced the Green Investment Bank. That is a bank that funds energy and green projects up and down the country. Here in Cambridge, we're looking at building an energy centre next to Adam Brooks Hospital. to reduce our carbon emissions at the hospital, to reinvest in our boilers and the utility systems to make them more energy efficient, less polluting, and that actually will enable us to put money back into the front line. How is that project costed? How is that project funded? This is where you get a pragmatic, practical perspective that is achievable. So, it costs 36 million. The government funds the Green Investment Bank, which is putting 18 million into that project. Because it is a government-backed project, we've managed to buy in a private partner, Aviva, for the balance 18 million. Otherwise, it's not affordable. So it's actually about working with business, corporate social responsibility arms of business, in order to be able to incentivize business to be green. Unless the green economy demonstrates to business that it works, it's achievable to be green, you will always push the environment back. And get this, the environment can't wait 50 years for the party that came fourth in the last general election to be able to elect an MP.
Thank you. Julian, are you a pragmatist as well? Or where do you stand on this line? And then please do that quite quickly, but then we move to the local level.
Okay.
I would quite like to hear what you did in Cambridge and what you propose to change.
Absolutely, but just very quickly on this, I thought I might set out some of what has been achieved, because we've had Lib Dem Energy and Climate Change Secretaries for the last 5 years. We've actually seen some really good things. One of the problems is nobody talks about it. Quite a lot of the Tories don't want to talk about it because there still are too many Tories who are resistant, the Chancellor being one of them. Of course, the opposition don't want to talk about the successes for obvious reasons, they're in opposition. But we've almost tripled the amount of renewable electricity in this country. Almost tripled it. That's a huge amount of growth. We need to go further, absolutely. But a tripling in 5 years is really very important. We set standards so you can't rent out properties that aren't decently insulated. We've insulated another 1 million homes. There is a lot of good progress. For what it's worth, by the way, I am anti-fracking. I led the vote to try to say that we should have a moratorium on it. Where I disagree with Rupert is that I'm actually in favour of nuclear as a low-carbon source. I'd love to see nuclear fusion. We're 25 years away from that, as we have been for 50 years. In the meantime, what would be much, much better is thorium nuclear reactors. They're much, much safer, much, much more efficient. The only disadvantage in them, and the reason we didn't use them many years ago, is because they don't make anything you can make a bomb out of. Personally, I see the inability to make bombs as quite a good feature these days. If Iran and North Korea were developing thorium reactors, we'd be in a much better place. Lastly, very quickly, in my party's manifesto, we have 5 green laws that form the centrepiece. And those 5, if we could get those passed, a nature bill, a heating and energy efficiency bill, zero waste Britain bill, zero carbon Britain bill, and a green transport bill, would really transform our country for the next 5 years, 10 years, and century.
What changes in Cambridge with you as a MP?
Right, I'm going to come on to that, but I'm just meant to correct 1 or 2 things that Julian
Very
said
quickly,
just now. On environmental issues, no independent commentator is going to give this government the kind of top marks that Julian did. Things like, for instance, the Green Deal was a total disaster. We ended up being the only country that really hasn't got a proper system for encouraging home insulation. One of the first things this government did was scrap the tough environmental standards on new house building. So I don't accept that argument. Now, looking at Cambridge specifically, I've already alluded to the housing crisis that we've got and some of the proposals that Labour's got for that. But the big thing I do is tackle the inequality and low pay issues in this city. 4,000 people using the Cambridge Food Bank is a disgrace in a wealthy city. And partly it's about low pay. And I'm a trade union official and I see this on a daily basis. And for instance, it's astonishing that the University of Cambridge, that can produce a magnificent building like this, cannot find the money to pay 1,000 of its staff a living wage. Yep, very good. And we're all working on it. It's quite hard to practice one, but basically a Labour government will make it much, much easier to do this. And a lot of this actually is going to be about the local issues. The MP working with local authorities and councils. We now have a Labour-led council in Cambridge, and I think it will be much easier for me to work with them than perhaps the predecessor council to challenge some of these things. Just finally, the buses. For a lot of people in Cambridge, they do rely on the buses. They're expensive, they don't run on time, they're not very regular, and at the moment there's not a thing we can do about them. But Labour will give us the powers to regulate those buses as they do in London, and that will be a big change.
Thank you very much. Well, you will have 1 minute at the end to wrap up your last comments, but now we have quite a long time for questions from the floor. So you are all encouraged to ask any questions. It's very important that you have your mind. So first hand up was you, actually.
Yeah, I mean, it's a judgment call, isn't it? I might just say, looking at Scotland, the idea that referendum settles the issue doesn't seem to me to be entirely made. And I just don't think that Bill Cash and his Eurosceptic friends in the Conservative Party, who've been banging on about this for 20 years, are going to say, OK, we've had the referendum, we're giving up now. They'll be carrying on the following day. So I don't think referendums settle things. And actually, I quite like elections to settle things. This is my 5th parliamentary election. Every election I've fought has had an EU referendum party candidate or a UKIP candidate. So every election, people have had the opportunity to vote for that. So my party thinks that actually tackling the NHS, tackling low pay, tackling inequality, those are the things that we hear from our people are the priority, and that's what we're going to get on with next week.
Are there any more questions from the floor?
We'll take 3 questions at a time so that there's a chance for everyone to ask the questions.
Do you ask any question related to democracy or information?
Yeah.
3 questions at a time. And please stand up and say your name so that everyone can hear it well. It's important, otherwise we don't hear.
Yeah, so I'm just going to take the second 2 questions, because people didn't answer different questions if I've understood you correctly. You've got a more short amount of time. But on the final question, really good question. Everyone's going to say, oh yes, we're going to cut down on tax evasion. Our MP in the Green Party, Caroline Lucas, has been incredibly proactive on this. She works very closely with Richard Murphy, who lives here in the East. He's the world expert on stopping tax evasion. He was here speaking to the Cambridge Greens recently, which was wonderful. And basically, our idea in the Greens is we have to go really, really seriously for this, far more seriously than the present government. Richard Murphy has written the laws that would enable that to happen. Caroline has already introduced some of them into Parliament. So if I'm your MP, I will press on that very, very strongly, and the others will try and say something similar. But if you want to look into the details, look at what Richard Murphy's saying, look at what Caroline Lucas has been doing. The Greens are the ones who are really pressing the hardest on this by far. On the previous question, I couldn't agree with the question more, well, especially on the bit about not wanting the 3 old parties anymore. But no, in all seriousness, I think that what Ed Miliband has done now in saying no deal at all with the SNP is a really awful mistake from the point of view of progressive voices in this country. Because what he's doing is he's essentially saying there's not going to be any stable government after the election. And that if that government staggers on for a while and fails, then there'll be a new election which risks the return of a Conservative government. Perhaps it will have an overall majority after several months of instability. It's a desperate, historic mistake. And I can't understand why he's done it, unless the truth is that he actually hates the SNP and Plaid and the Green Party even more than he hates the Conservative Party. Who knows, maybe we're going to end up with a grand coalition in this country, like they have in Germany, you know? Many people said it would never happen in Germany, could it happen here? It seems that Miliband is so in bed now with the right-wing press in scaremongering about the SNP that he's prepared. I mean, he really, if you listen to the rhetoric from Jim Murphy and people like that about the SNP now, it's really hardcore, Daniel, and I think you should talk to your leadership about it and try to bring them in a bit. Because what we want in the Green Party, what we want is to be part of a strong anti-austerity bloc in the House of Commons after the election. I would want to be there working with Plaid MPs, SNP MPs, and I'd like to be working with a Labour minority government, but you're saying you're not interested in working with us. I think that's really sad. My final point on this would be, I would urge anyone in the room, don't vote for any of the old 3 parties, vote SNP or Plaid or Green. I leave it totally up to you which to vote for.
Sure. First of all, Julian gets the prize for being the person who's attended most hustings. Justin, gets the prize for being terrible.
Julian
Julian gets the prize for being equal first in a number of hustings events. But you've tried to ask this question many, many times. And I don't think actually we're going to go beyond the current Freedom of Information Act for the reasons that have been rehearsed. So that's what I would support. And actually it's much better having the Freedom of Information Act that Labour introduced than the situation before when so much was secret and not open. In terms of the question about coalitions and so on, look, the reason Ed Miliband said what he said is because we believe in the manifesto that we're putting forward, and we believe it is radical and progressive, and I think there's plenty of things I can point to in it which I'm very, very proud of, particularly things like decarbonising the power sector. And interestingly, there are lots of things which a number of members of this panel will say they want to do, re-regulating buses, for instance, only possible with a Labour government. So
Why
I
do
don't.
they-
So I'm not going to barter away those things.
I don't want you to barter them
No,
away.
so you can just agree with them in that case. It's not a problem. I mean, basically, if you want a government that's going to do those progressive things, the simple thing to do is to vote for it and make sure there are plenty of Labour MPs. Now, if we don't get to the point where we need to get because of what's happened in Scotland, I just also don't buy the argument. The SNP are this wonderful radical alternative. Look at what they've actually done in practice in Scotland. It's not nearly as progressive as people make out. You know, they've had the opportunity to raise taxation, they haven't used it, they've had a council tax freeze, there are all kinds of things. The rhetoric's great, but there's a big gap between the rhetoric and the reality. So what we will do if we're in that situation is we will put our programme forward, a programme that very large numbers of people will have voted for, and then it's up to others to decide whether they support it or not. And then finally, on the tax...
We'll just finish the round of questions and then you'll have another chance to answer.
Let's talk about it afterwards.
Yeah, please, because in the interest of time. Very quickly then, please.
No,
Yeah, that's the risk.
Not in the slightest.
That's the
No,
risk.
it's not. And on tax evasion, I think this is really interesting because everybody says they want to do it. And I think what Labour outlined in its manifesto this time is much tougher and more radical than before. And those who are sceptical would say we didn't do it last time. I'd say there's a reason for that. Ed Miliband is actually very different from the previous Labour government, much more radical, much less tied to business in the way that the previous Labour government was. This is a real, for those of you who want radical change, trust me, this is the best chance we've had for a generation and probably for a generation to come. So there's a real possibility here. It's not going to come again probably.
Chamali, would you like to refer to any?
Some of the questions and some of the points made from the panel, I'll just try and address as many as possible in the 90-second time that we've got for each answer. Earlier, we spoke about institutions and how we would get countries to comply with their carbon emission levels. I just want to talk about a World Environmental Organization and also the International Court for the Environment project that I'm working on quite closely. Currently, Kyoto protocols are breached, there are no sanctions. So an International Court for the Environment is something that would be able to have teeth and deal with countries in those respects, and also give communities, not just states, environmental access to justice, so a form of proper redress. In terms of we've got the media, we were accused of not talking about our environmental and our green achievements in this government.
Please refer to the question.
I will come to that as well within the 9 seconds. In terms of that, we don't get the chance all the time when we're on the media. We're pontificating on the outcome of an election, which actually you have the chance to decide. And it's not always about the economy. There's lots we've done in this government. But what I would ask you to do is judge us on our track record, read the manifestos of each party. On the issue about coalition governments, we have demonstrated our ability to come together at a time of economic crisis and actually work with another party. And if you read the manifestos, certainly I've read our own manifesto and I've actually had the opportunity to read the Lib Dem manifesto, there are a few areas of overlap. So we have demonstrated areas where we could work together. The achievements and objectives are the same. And there's one or two within the Labour Party that are similar to ours. Labour actually didn't address the tax dodging problem because they thought they'd end with boom and bust. The reality is, under this government, we have taken in another 85 billion through some of our clamping down on tax dodging. The other thing is we've reduced corporation tax, so we've incentivized companies, look, come and locate here, locate your main principal place of business here and pay the tax in this country. So that's one way we're doing it, but we're also investing in HMRC, looking at big business. Let's see, there was another question.
And maybe to Julian now. Sorry,
Okay,
sorry,
all
because
right,
90
that's
seconds
fine.
is 90 seconds.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, lots to cover. Daniel always says, Ed Miliband's different from the last Labour government, but of course he was a key advisor in the last Labour government that made a whole lot of promises, then it didn't do very much. And that's my big problem, is I do consider myself a progressive. And I like some of the rhetoric about what Labour want to achieve. When you look at what happened in 13 years, unemployment went up, inequality went up, the amount of social housing in this country went down. All of those are completely the wrong things. I'd be much happier if they'd actually gone in the right direction. I don't think these 5 years have pulled everything in the right direction. Actually, we've done better on those three measures. But there is much more to do, and I was shocked when Labour ruled out that SNP deal. I think it is going to lead us into complete chaos, and the idea that you're not prepared to talk to people because you don't like them, that's the politics of the playground, not the politics of responsible parliament. I hope that will change. You might be interested, incidentally, from the progressivity thing. There was a thing called the UK Poverty Audit, which is an analysis of all the parties' manifestos. How good would they be at tackling poverty? They rated us higher than Labour. The Greens were higher than us, I admit, but you can use fantastic money rather more easily in some ways. But we are higher than Labour, and I think that's quite an important point. We have made some changes. So, for example, Labour did nothing about non-DOMs. We've collected huge amounts of money from non-DOMs. It could have been £2 billion if they'd done it. We did tackle zero-hour contracts and various other things. We introduced a Google tax to deal with the issue that you were talking about of people just moving things overseas. That's starting to help. We need to go further. I've been working with Oxfam and Christian Aid and others on a tax dodging bill that would tackle that, something we should introduce really quickly within the first 100 days. Very, very quickly on freedom of information. Because I know you want to have an answer to it. One of the good things Labour did was to introduce the Freedom of Information Act. It doesn't, as I was going to say, it doesn't go far enough, and it's a shame Tony Blair described it as one of his biggest mistakes. We would get rid of the ministerial veto on it, and we'd also expand it to cover all private companies providing public sector services, so it would go further, not quite as far as you want though.
I'm with Ed Miliband on this. I don't think it was too many nurses at Adam Brooks or too many teachers in our schools that caused the economic crisis. I really don't. And actually, if you look at the levels of borrowing, they were much higher at the start of the Labour period, which we inherited from the last government, than at the time the financial crisis happened. The financial crisis was a global financial crisis. It's absolutely true to say that we shouldn't have trusted the city and the banks in the way that we did. We weren't the only ones, and at the time the Conservatives were warning that we were over-regulating, not under-regulating. But it happened on our watch, and unsurprisingly, we take the blame. So, but I don't think it was to do with too much public spending. And this is part of the problem. The reason the Conservatives' economic policy has failed is because they didn't understand the problem. And if you misunderstand the problem in the first place, just cutting public spending, which they're trying to do, it's no surprise it hasn't solved the problem. So, wrong analysis, wrong solution. Labour's got a different solution for the future, which is actually tackling the inequality and the low pay, which is actually at heart of our economic problems. So I think others were going to answer on those other points. But the 10 times value question, I mean, solving the British housing market has puzzled people like me and many others, many wiser people than me for many, many years. I mean, I've been involved in housing policy for Labour for a long time. I don't think we're going to solve it quickly, but what I would say is that scrapping your regional policy, which is effectively what this government did on day one, is absolutely the wrong way of going about it. I think that's partly what it's about. I mean, Labour had a strong regional policy, and you have to intervene. If you don't, markets will have their own logic. And I think Vince Cable described his own department constructing the regional development agencies as a Maoist approach to policy making. It was a big, big mistake, and we need to turn that back if we're actually going to start rebalancing the distribution of resources within our country. But it's not going to happen in a 5-year term, in my view. It's a very hard thing to argue, to stop the big forces that are at play. And this goes back to the inequality point. When globally, the balance between capital and labour has shifted over the last 10, 20, 30 years. And that's why you need governments working really hard to try and balance that. The last Labour government put in place huge restrictive changes, and even then, it was only just holding the line. And if you don't do it, it just gets much worse, which is what's happening now.
Thank you. Rupert, would you like to?
Yeah, so great questions, thank you. So the North-South divide question, well, to take up the regional aspect of it, which Daniel's mentioned rightly, our view in the Greens is that Labour were already not going far enough on that in the last government, let alone what's happened since. We want to see a full-on return to regional policy in this country, and what that means is that you try to ensure that most of the so-called development and regeneration happens in parts of the country which really need it and that have the capacity to absorb it. There are many parts, for example, of the Midlands and the North where there are very substantial brownfield sites, where there are significant numbers of people unemployed, etc. What we need to do is to make those parts of the country work, not keep on trying to cram more and more and more people into the southeast in the way that when you let the markets rip is happening. And that also, of course, letting the markets rip is just worsening the inequality crisis which this country and this planet face. We have grotesque levels of inequality in this country now. They've been going up through the Conservative government, through the Labour government. The Conservative and Lib Dem government now hasn't reversed them. We've got the food banks rise. We've got the Sunday Times rich elites having doubled their wealth since 2008. Grotesque levels of inequality. We in the Greens want to bring in a wealth tax so that those with assets of more than £3 million have to pay a little of that back to the rest of us. And at the lower end, we don't think it's enough to just try to encourage people to give a living wage. We want to make the minimum wage into a living wage. How can it be right that there's a minimum wage if people can't live off? Yeah? So we need to change this situation, the absurd situation of extreme inequality in this country. That's the only way we're really going to address the north-south divide. And then finally, to take that onto the housing in Cambridge question, we need to have rent controls, we need to have longer tenures for people renting. We want to take it up to 5 years if that's what you want. Crucially, we need to have much more social housing. We need to build 500,000 social homes over the life of a parliament. We can do that on brownfield sites in this country if we're determined to. And they have to stay social homes, they have to stay affordable. And that means we have to abolish the Thatcherite madness of the right to buy. And we're the only party that's prepared to do that.
Thanks. Chamali.
On the issue of how do you develop the north, one, it's not just about building in the north, but also regional development zones, regional enterprise zones. And I don't subscribe to this idea of poverty of ambition. I believe that actually, by better roads, better transport, better communication, modern communication, you can start to develop the north more. So I'd be in favour of that. The lady that asked about housing supply and rental increases, the reality is if you fix rents now, all that will happen in 3 years' time at the end of that fixed rent period is the rent will shoot up dramatically as the landlord looks to recoup his losses or her losses over the period of time. So actually what you need to do is increase supply. Whilst Cambridge looks like a very full city, the reality is we are set to grow, whether we like it or not. We're set to double in our size within the next 10 years. Now that means we need to have a proper growth strategy in place in order to ensure we retain the aesthetic beauty of Cambridge, but also accommodate this level of growth and ensure that people can get access to the housing market. So, for example, one of the measures we're putting in is 200 across the country, 200,000 new starter homes for those under the age of 40 to buy a property below market value, 20% below market value. Did Labour overspend? Yes, they did, but also the key issue as to why we face such a major economic crash is because Labour turned a blind eye for 12 months when they knew about Bradford and Bingley, they knew about Northern Rock Asset Management. So, don't trust a party, particularly a party who said after 2010, where's your plan B? Where's your plan B? Can anyone remember Ed Ball screaming that in Parliament? It's suddenly gone very quiet because actually we have got a bit better. Yes, we have a lot more to do. And yet we're asking you to give us that 5 years more to be able to do that balance. But the deficit has been halved by a share of GDP.
Thank you.
Just very quickly on that last question. Vince Cable, of course, warned about some of the problems ahead of time. And my thing is, I'm a Keynesian. And Keynes doesn't just say spend more when times are bad. It's counter-cyclical. You have to spend less when times are good. You can't be a half Keynesian. That doesn't work. You have to be a full Keynesian or not at all. To move on to the other questions, Guy, I think your question about the North. It is a huge issue. We are an incredibly London-centred country. Everything looks towards London. All our transport links radiate out of London, make it very hard to go east-west. It's just really poor. And that's one of the reasons why we have that decline. It's also connected to the decline of manufacturing in this country, something which has to be reversed. So we've done a few things like regional growth funds, and I think that's helping in some areas. We are beginning to see more growth in the north, finally. Nothing like enough, I'm certainly not complacent about it. But building that up and getting better transport links is a really key part of it. And also having decent vehicles on that. The trains that are run up in that area are often really, really poor, because they're the ones that everyone else has finished with and get passed up. That can't last. Emily, your question is absolutely key, really important. I quickly touched on it right at the beginning of my speech. You have the problem of low incomes and high prices. You have to fix both of those. So to fix low incomes, you have to increase the national minimum wage, and we are, I think, the first people ever to do that by more than was recommended by the Low Pay Commission. You also should push a living wage. I've been championing that with many companies. That will help to get people money. Also, lifting the threshold for income tax means that people who are low earners get to keep more of what they earn. It seems to me wrong that somebody on £12,500 should be expected to pay income tax. They need that money, particularly somewhere like Cambridge. Then the other bit is about the costs of renting. So I had legislation to tackle some of the letting agent fees, which make it extortionate, longer term tenancies as well. We have to do social housing, council housing, intermediate housing. But the key answer is to build more houses in Cambridge and in the country. Across the country, we need 225,000 a year just to keep pace with demand. You have to go beyond that if you want to start bringing prices down. That's what we would do. One answer for Cambridge as well, East-West Rail linking Oxford and Cambridge, and a station at Addenbrooke's means you build garden cities along that way. So people can be 15 minutes away from Addenbrooke's, 20 from the station at the moment, 25 minutes from the science park, much more housing available. Do that with March and Wisbech as well. You start to bring the prices down.
Thank you very much. We'll move to another round of questions. Julian, you can start.
I mean, in fairness, UKIP has missed almost every other hustings, so you're not special in that regard. To pick up the question about Labour's position on immigration, I mean, I think it's shocking. And Labour have been playing some really nasty games on this. Labour are selling a mug that's controlling immigration. That's why you should vote Labour. You know, that's just as much an effort to target the UKIP-influenced people as it was when the Tories started talking about, you know, immigration. Are you thinking what we're thinking? You know, it's the same type of messaging, and that's why Diane Abbott, the Labour MP, you know, very outspoken, described it as shameful and embarrassing, but said that selling the mug wasn't as bad as Labour's policy, which was even worse. So I think that's a real problem. I'm very proud of immigration. I've spoken out on it time and time and time again. It does get a bit lonely with the other parties running away from being so positive about immigration. The question about an EU referendum, I don't think it would make sense in the slightest. I certainly don't think we would be able to form a coalition if that was part of the requirement. Frankly, there are now so many things where what the Tories are saying are simply incompatible with what we would do. Because a lot of it's the things we didn't let them do in 5 years because they were daft ideas then. They're still daft ideas. I don't think it would be possible to do another deal, but that may just be me. And you're assuming there's no chance of a grand coalition, which Rupert quite rightly thought may well be the outcome. Nuclear. I don't think there's any case for a nuclear deterrent. I don't think we need it. I don't think we want it. And crucially, it weakens our moral case to persuade others to disarm. How can you say to a country, you should not have nuclear weapons because you're a bad country, but it's okay because we're good people, we wouldn't use them badly? You know, how can you have that argument? It's just dishonest. I'd much rather say, Iran, whoever, you shouldn't have them. We got rid of ours. That's why we're allowed to say that. Plus, there's a massive cost. And if you wanted to spend the money to make us safer, there are far better ways to spend it.
Exactly. The ladies just answered it.
Yeah, so Lib Dem policy is to say we would stop continuous at sea deterrence and make sure we didn't build anything that could only be used for nuclear weapons. Many of us want to go, it's about a ladder you have to climb down. I want to get off that ladder completely and utterly. We've got the Tories wedded to it, we've got Labour so wedded to it that the number one reason Ed Miliband gave for saying he wouldn't do a deal with the SNP, if you listen to what he said, his first reason was because Trident is not negotiable. There's a Labour MP who signed a pledge, so if Labour do not build 4 submarines, he's being specific about 4, he will resign as an MP. So we are actually trying to leap down, and I have already voted to say we should scrap it completely. And the reason it hasn't been replaced yet is because we didn't let the Tories do it when Labour and the Tories wanted to in the last Parliament.
Chamali, you want?
Yeah, actually what they're promoting is a diminished form of Trident, not scrapping it entirely. Right. So it's just it's a complete wishy-washy answer there. In terms of the other questions, UKIP don't need to comment on the European referendum, and I've got European referendum, nuclear deterrent, and just the UKIP question. So in terms of immigration. And look, as far as we're concerned, the reality is Britain has been great over the last 5 years. There's a lot more that we can do. It has attracted foreign investment to this country. It has attracted foreigners to this country. And actually here in Cambridge, we're very lucky. The type of immigration to Cambridge generally tends to be people who want to make an effective contribution to society. Either they're coming to the university, or they're coming to work in our science or clean tech clusters. So it has been a positive thing over the last 5 years. Yes, okay, we thought we would be able to reduce immigration dramatically, but hey, guess what? Britain became great over the last 5 years again, so people are coming here, and I don't think we should stop that. However, I was born and raised in Leicester, a city that is regarded as the #1 multicultural, majority ethnic, non-white city in Europe, in Britain. There you see a lack of social cohesion, a lack of social harmony, different communities living in different pockets, and no one integrates. I was brought up as a Buddhist. There weren't that many Sri Lankan Buddhists in Leicester at the time. There weren't that many Sri Lankans, so my family navigated a path by socialising with all the different communities. But we noticed even within certain communities there was a caste system. People wouldn't marry within their own community. That's not healthy for society. Leicester has a Sharia law tribunal. That, frankly, is a disgrace in my view, because no one should be above the rule of law. There shouldn't be another legal system in this country for other people to use. So there are issues on immigration in different parts of the country, strains on public sector services that we don't necessarily see in Cambridge.
Thank you. Now you're off.
Rupert.
Yeah, I'm going to focus on the nuclear question because it's so important. Let me start with Julian's remarks. I think it's great that Julian's anti-Trident. Daniel's anti-Trident as well, and I'm anti-Trident. So it might seem that we're all the same, but let me explain to you why we're not. So firstly, on Lib Dem policy, Chamali's absolutely right. Julian didn't give you a really very full disclosure on what Lib Dem policy is. Lib Dem policy is to have 3 Trident nuclear missile submarines rather than 4.
That's not right.
It's not a massive difference. 3 rather than 4. They still want a full-on so-called independent nuclear deterrent. By the way, very important point about Trident. Well, my understanding is that it is right from having listened to Nick Clegg. A very important point about...
don't trust him, though.
Well, very good. Very important point about Trident. It's not actually an independent nuclear deterrent, by the way, right? They call it an independent nuclear deterrent, but it actually relies thoroughly for technological know-how and maintenance on the US. If the US withdrew its support for Trident, the resident military experts reckon it would be unusable within about 3 or 4 months. But of course, a far more important point is, these weapons are completely immoral and never are usable at all. So we in the Greens are absolutely staunchly anti-Trident. It's an issue that I've been passionate, campaigned on for years, including doing direct action against Trident. So I'm very committed on this. Now, why does it matter which of the 3 of us you vote for, given that Julian's in a minority in his party, Daniel's in a minority in his party, I'm with all of my party, and we're all anti-Trident. Here's why it matters. Say Ed Miliband is Prime Minister but doesn't have an overall majority. There's only one circumstance under which we can stop Trident in that situation, and that is if there is a deal between the Labour Party and the Anti-Austerity Alliance, SNP, Plaid and Green, which I'm still hoping will happen, even though Miliband has ruled it out, apparently, stupidly. That's the only circumstance under which it won't go through. Because if there is just a Labour minority government with no deal with anybody, he'll force Trident through, relying on Labour and Lib Dem MPs to get it through. Right? So the only way you can stop Trident at this election, the only way, you've got a historic opportunity now to end Britain's absurd, obscene, immoral, illegal so-called nuclear deterrent. The only way you can stop it is by voting SNP, Plaid and Green. I've already made the point about that.
Yeah, on the nuclear deterrent, I mean, Julian and I are in the same position in relation to our parties, that we don't agree with our party's policies. So on that, there's a little difference between us. On the immigration question, though, I mean, the reason we say that Cameron has failed is because he set up this ridiculous promise of, reducing net migration down to very low levels. What a stupid thing to say when it was almost always going to be impossible to do. And the damage it has done, particularly in terms of students, and for a place like Cambridge, really, really important. We have argued throughout that there was damaging, it couldn't be done, and it was doing us huge harm in the rest of the world. So, we would have not done that. We've got a completely different policy on that. But let's be clear here. UKIP benefited, I would say, from a failure amongst the political class to have a sensible conversation about immigration over a long time. And there's a whole section of people who I look to support Labour who are worried. And they're worried because they're being undercut. And it's about jobs. And speaking to trade unions, that matters. So, and I think the difference that Miliband's made It is much, much clearer. It's about tackling exploitation, not just of our workforce, but actually of migrant workers. You don't have to go very far outside of Cambridge to see in the fields people being exploited and living in really poor conditions. And what we want to do is toughen up the law, but actually there are some laws already in place on this which is not being enforced. You know, the number of minimum wage convictions is tiny, and that's partly because the current government just keeps sacking the people who are doing those jobs. So we've got a different approach to this, and we do have to reassure people in Britain that it's a fair system and that they can have confidence in it, because if we don't, we're going to go on seeing the rise of nuclear. So I think that's a sensible, balanced approach to immigration. It's not going to go away as an issue, and I think, to be honest, it's going to be one of the issues of this century, particularly if we fail to tackle climate change. The movements of people, suddenly, are going to be really, really challenging, and it could become very, very dangerous indeed. There's always, we must never confuse asylum and economic migration. They're different things. But the movement of peoples is really, really important. And I think Labour is approaching it in a responsible and sensible way. And we are. It's an absolute duty on us to reassure people.
Thank you, Chamali. You have 30 seconds just to come back on one point, and then we move to the last round of questions.
The point about Julian's red line on referendum for Europe. Julian, I think, had a red line on tuition fees, and clearly in favour of a position in government, was willing to scrap that. So you just can't believe what's happening on the road.
Sorry, Chamali. I mean, first is, you know, it wasn't a front-page manifesto issue. Secondly, you also know that I voted against it, which is why NUS have said that I was a great friend to the student movement. So you're right that both the Tories and Labour wanted to put fees up, and you're right that we lost that fight. But I think for you to blame us for losing a fight is slightly bizarre.
I knew in 2009 I was a Lib Dem, and I knew that they could not deliver on tuition fees. It's on the internet that people said, did Chamali Fernando leave the Lib Dems because we knew that we in the Lib Dems could not deliver on tuition
on that
fees.
Note,
he stood on that platform in 2010.
We moved to questions and voted with it.
Last three questions from the floor.
Very inaccuracy Chamali's statement about Sharia law in Leicester sounded like something out of Fox News. Sharia law above the law. This is dispute resolution in civil cases, and you're a lawyer, you should know better.
Actually,
It's matrimonial cases,
it has been used for domestic violence cases, and I have
We try to be on with that, so everyone has got a chance to respond, but our question will be addressed now to the next one, please.
On assisted dying, I was for the bill. There are more things that one might want to see in terms of safeguards, but that's roughly where I stand on that side of that argument. The crisis in general practice, I think, is really serious. When Claire Garada's spoken directly to Labour politicians about this and about the declining funding, and that's a much bigger question about how you put funding into the health service. But my party is the only one who's actually got a specific pledge, which is to raise a maximum tax of £2.5 billion. It's not just about money, I know, it's also about an integrated care system. So these are signposts which you will understand. And then on Putin, or crikey, in 30 seconds, basically we've got to work with others, like-minded people, and try and keep de-escalating the tension, would be my view. But I think Putin's very dangerous. I think it's a very dangerous situation, and we've just got to be very, very careful.
Yeah, so on the Putin and the Ukraine, one key point I would make in the 15 seconds I have on this is Europe needs to become energy independent. You know, one of the key reasons why we have a problem here is that the east of Europe in particular is utterly dependent upon Russian gas. So we need to move to 100% renewables as quickly as possible. That's what the Green Party internationally is seeking to do. On assisted dying, I think there's quite a lot wrong with the Faulkner bill, actually, but I am a massive advocate of assisted dying. I think it's absolutely immoral to keep people alive when they want to die. I have a living will myself, so I would be strongly looking to support a bill on this, provided it was much better written than the Faulkner bill. And on your other question about the crisis in general practice and so on, in my remaining 10 seconds, one of the fundamental problems here is that the NHS doesn't have enough money, and we in the Greens would give it £12 billion, not just £12 billion, which we would pay for out of the wealth tax. But the NHS costs are going to go on going up forever unless we tackle those rising costs, and there are two key causes of those rising costs. One is incremental privatisation of the NHS, And we are the only party in the Green Party that are against that. We're the only party that wants to reverse that tide of privatisation, who says it's wrong to make money off people being ill. And the other is that our society is getting less healthy in all sorts of ways. Air pollution is getting worse. Obesity is getting worse. Stress is getting worse. Inequality, the number one root cause of mental ill health, is getting worse. So we need to reverse those things, and that's what green policy is designed to do.
Thank you. Chamali.
In terms of Russia, very quickly, that we need to look at international cooperation, particularly with civic actors on the ground, and also this is another reason for not scrapping Trident, because actually Russia is in a really volatile state. On the assisted dying, there's actually, in my view, only one proper safeguard, which is 2 doctors' reports before a judge and confirmation from a judge that the person insisting will not face prosecution. That, regrettably, is not practical in terms of funding it, and on a case-by-case basis. So I'm actually against assisted suicide. Fundamentally, from a Buddhist perspective, it's something that I find very difficult to subscribe to in any event. A crisis of GPs, in whatever time I have left. Prevention over cure. The NHS is actually a really big black hole because you can't budget for problems that people might have. You might have an emergency, earthquake or something, and loads of people will be rushing to A&E. GPs crisis. The reality is out of access hours for GPs is going to help people be able to access the treatment they want. Keeping an NHS that is free at the point of delivery, so the patient never pays. We have got certain elements of privatisation. It was first privatised under Labour, 5%, and then under this government just under a further 1%. But that privatisation includes contracts out to charities like Macmillan Cancer, nurses. We're contracting out palliative care at a critical time in someone's life through the NHS. That's considered a private contract. So there's elements of where it can work, but obviously, fundamentally, it is important that the NHS is free, and the reality, under this government, we've put the highest any government has into the National Health Service, 12.9 billion, the number of doctors is up by 9,500, the number of nurses by 7,000, and the number of midwives by 2,200. It is a funding black hole for the reasons I've outlined.
On assisted dying, I am in favour of it, something like the Faulkner Bill. I think it could be tweaked, because you have to make sure the safeguards are there. So it's about voluntary choice, not about coercion, whether that's explicit or implicit. Finding that balance is the real challenge, but I do think it's cruel when you have people who are clearly articulating their wish to die. To say that that can't be done just seems fundamentally wrong to me. In terms of the NHS and funding issues, so Simon Stevens, the Chief Executive of the NHS England, has said that the NHS must have at least £8 billion by 2020 to keep going. I think that's quite a tight settlement, but I'm prepared to accept it. And I think as politicians we shouldn't meddle with the details of health, we should sometimes listen to experts. So we set an aim months ago to say that we would find that £8 billion. We've identified a long list of ways to pay for it, so that we have said we'll do it and how we'll pay for it. Labour would put less money in. The Tories have been very unclear about where the money would come from. George Osborne was asked 18 times and didn't know. If you don't get that money in, the NHS is going to have huge problems. One of the few things I think politicians should really press on is about getting a lot of it spent on mental health, because that's been ignored for far, far too many decades. We can't allow that to keep going. There's much more to say about health, but I think I'll probably leave it there. Just very quickly on the Russian issue. I think Rupert's absolutely right to say that energy independence is an important aspect, because as long as so much of Eastern Europe is dependent on Russia, which is very hard to do the sort of actions that we ought to be doing. So some of those include things like stronger sanctions targeted at some of the senior people. Some of the Magnitsky rules, for example, could be brought in. But it's not an easy situation. I don't have a good answer, other than having Trident is not something I think would stop Putin, and are we really going to blow up Russia?
So I encourage all of you to ask your questions at the end of the event, but now we'll have to conclude. And in the interest of fairness, we haven't given a chance to Julian, Chamali and Rupert to talk about what they will do in Cambridge. So you have a little bit of time to do that very quickly. And then we'll move to concluding remarks from each of the speakers. You have 1 minute for that. So first of all, Cambridge, and then concluding remarks.
in one go? Or?
No, in 2 goes.
Right, okay.
I think.
Okay.
Can go.
Yeah. Fine. So key issues for Cambridge. I touched on housing and transport earlier. We need to do much more to get the affordable housing in place and transport. We haven't talked about very much about walking, about cycling, active transport, huge benefits for the NHS, huge reductions in congestion. Regulating buses like in the London model, 2/3 off bus travel for young people. I think that's a really exciting thing to get more people to use buses, which means there'll be more buses. Schools in Cambridgeshire have been the worst funded in the entire country, have been very, very low for 30 years. As of last month, they got us an extra £23.2 million across the county. That's half the gap. You have to have a full national fair funding formula so our kids get a proper start. On the NHS, it's about bringing more money in, it's about the mental health. It's also actually about dealing with the A&E aspect specifically by making sure that there is alternative places for people to go, for frail elderly, to get out of Addenbrooke's. That is the big hold-up in A&E. That is the biggest problem, other than E Hospital perhaps, is finding somewhere to go. That's why I pushed to get Brookfield's hospital to open a new ward, so there's more capacity there. We need to have those sorts of beds in order to free up the space to get A&E flow through. That is going to be one of the big challenges. The older people's services will make a big difference. And then lastly, the inequality points. And I really, we've talked about this quite a lot. Helping people at the low end to earn more and keep more and collecting more from the very wealthiest.
Yeah, you have a little bit of time on local because they didn't have the chance to do that before.
So, for example, take the £1 billion city deal. Whilst I'm very proud that it's been pledged and partly delivered under a Conservative government with local actors as well, the reality is we heard at the Cambridge cycling hustings that the Shard cost £1 billion to build. So £1 billion for all our housing projects, for our transport, it's actually not enough. So you need an advocate in Parliament who can campaign for more than £1 billion. Some of the work that I'm doing already in Cambridge is involved with schools, so Cambridge Area Partnership and Cambridge Ahead, about bridging that gap, about getting children with special needs into better schools, and also into apprenticeships. It's about approaching big business and giving them the opportunity to take on children who face challenges in terms of getting jobs and apprenticeships. So my key issues for Cambridge: 1, transport, you can't move around this city in a hurry. 2, housing. I've spoken about regeneration and the need for more housing and what we're going to do in that regard. But it's so important that we retain our aesthetic beauty in Cambridge. In terms of education, we've already pledged in our manifesto that we will deliver more funding for extra schools funding for all the local authorities where they are significantly lacking below the average. And Cambridge historically, regrettably, has faced this funding problem, partly because successive governments have thought, well, we've got some of the best teachers in Cambridge. But now we are getting that money. It has been delivered under a coalition government with the Lib Dems as a minority partner. And it's so important going into this election that people remember in this room that actually coalition achievements are just that. They are coalition achievements.
Thank you.
Yeah, so my number one local issue is transport, and that's a good thing because apparently it's your number one issue as well. In other words, opinion polls show that Cambridge residents, their top concern is transport, and it's not hard to understand why when you've experienced the terrible air pollution in Cambridge and the terrible traffic congestion and gridlock. So what's to be done about it? There's a whole raft of things. I don't have time to tell you about most of them, but in very brief, we need to massively improve cycling here. We need to roll out 20-mile-an-hour speed limits, pedestrianise more of the city centre. We need to re-regulate the buses, London style, as Daniel said. Daniel agrees with me on buses, Julian agrees with me on cycling. What unfortunately none of the other candidates from the old parties will do is actually bite the difficult bullet, which is if you're going to be serious about tackling transport, actually reducing air pollution, actually reducing congestion, you have to find some way of disincentivising all the cars and lorries from driving into or through Cambridge. So we in the Greens are saying it's time for Cambridge to think about a congestion charge. It's worked in London, it's worked in Durham, it's worked in various European cities that many of you may know. Unless you have that, or unless you have road user charging, something like that, you're not going to actually make the situation better here. So that's our number one priority, actually seriously, holistically addressing the transport problems in Cambridge. We've got a plan to fix it. Final point on local Cambridge issues. Please remember that on May the 7th, if you're a UK citizen, you have 2 votes. You have your local election vote and your general election vote. If you're an EU citizen, as I suspect some people in the room might be, i.e. EU citizen who's not UK citizen, you're also entitled to vote in the local election. I would urge you to use that vote. You have that vote for a reason. And if you like green transport policies, then might you want to vote green in the local election.
Daniel, do you want to conclude with your closing remarks?
Certainly. Well, can I thank you for a very good set of questions. We've covered a lot of ground in a relatively short time. Let me just finish on 1 or 2 points though. There's a few things we haven't mentioned, particularly welfare and the kind of threat to people right at the bottom of society if the Conservatives are in government this time next week. Things like the bedroom tax, for instance, which Labour would get rid of. But they're threatening £12 billion worth of welfare cuts without saying on whom they'll fall and how. And that's really serious for many of the people that I represent. Moving to the progressive side of the equation, we've heard lots of things actually where there's agreement tonight. But actually, the only government that's going to be able to do that is a Labour government. A Labour government. And I know there are people in this room who are struggling to decide who to support, who to vote for next week. But I would just ask you to reflect. Is it a symbolic act, voting? Is it some aspirational act? Or is it a real choice about which government is going to be there? It's going to either be Ed Miliband or David Cameron. And the numbers are pretty clear. If Labour doesn't win in Cambridge, it will be a Conservative government the following morning. So, it's a really hard choice, I know, for a lot of people. I know what I'm going to be voting. but for you, in the end, I say, it's over to you. You're the boss. You make the decision. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Vote for what you believe in. We've had a Clean Pledge campaign here in Cambridge. It has sadly been breached. Even before it was signed by all parties, it was breached. And actually there's been a lot of, oh, if you vote this way in Cambridge, this is what's going to happen. The reality is the Conservatives came second in Cambridge last time round on a limited campaign. And here, this time round, my team and I have been knocking on doors since the summer to try and tell you these are our policies and also listen to what the issues are that matter to you. You have in me a candidate who is not afraid of hard work, a candidate who has got 12 years bread and butter of working on people's everyday problems, but also the biggest difference is you have a candidate with a vision for this country, for this city. Cambridge should be punching well above its weight, and it's so shameful that that opportunity has not been taken. With all these bright minds in Cambridge, why can't we resolve our transport problems in Cambridge? We need to be sensible, we need to work together with different partners. There have been some very cohesive ideas on the platform. We're all in favour of better public transport. We're all in favour of better buses that are less polluting. But you have that with my candidacy, and that's why I'd urge you to vote Conservative on the 7th of May.
Julian, would you like to finish this?
You vote for a local MP. You don't vote for the Prime Minister. None of you can vote for a Prime Ministerial candidate. And because we are likely to be in a world where there will not be a majority, what will matter is what will your MP argue for? What are the things that they will put onto the table that no one else ever puts onto the table? And I've done a huge amount in those 5 years. Getting money for Cambridge, yes, but also bigger issues. Stopping the Snoopers Charter. Making revenge porn illegal. Much, much more. That is the thing that will matter. So you should be looking at the values of the individual candidate. And I've set out my values as a liberal. So I'm really passionate about it. It's why we did same-sex marriage, something which never happened and would not have happened without Liberal Democrats. So I'm an environmentalist. We've tripled renewables, something I'm very proud of, much more to do. I'm an internationalist, about the UN, about the European Union, and I'm committed to social justice. So if you actually want somebody who's shown over 5 years they'll stand up for you, stand up for Cambridge, and stand up for our shared values and actually deliver on them, then I hope you will vote to give me another 5 years of really incredibly hard work. And even if you can't vote, you can get involved in the campaign. And I am certainly looking for volunteers. So thank you very much for this last of many, many hustings. Thanks for listening.
So as I said at the start, if you're trying to choose between the 3 policy offers and candidate offers from the old parties here tonight, Well, I don't envy you. You've got a tough choice. But you do have another option, thankfully. There is a way you can vote, if you choose to, at this election, which goes beyond business as usual. The Green Party will actually tackle the scourge of inequality which has gone up under governments of all these parties. The Green Party is actually serious about the ecological crisis and the climate crisis, the issue on which our children and our grandchildren will judge us. So I would urge you, if you like what you've heard from me on these things this evening, vote for what you believe in, vote with your heart and your head, give us a chance. Remember, the Green Party, this was its third strongest seat at the last general election. If you think there should be at least 3 Green MPs, you need to be thinking about voting Green here. Be part of the Green surge. Vote for what you believe in. Thank you.